Chris Keefer, thanks a lot for joining us. To begin
Man,
with, we always want to get to know our guests a bit. So please tell us a bit about yourself, your background, education, and work.
sure, Matthias. First off, thanks for having me on your podcast. As a fellow podcaster, it's a great joy, both to interview and be interviewed. So
Yeah.
thanks for switching me on to the other side of the microphone. Yeah, so my name is Chris Keefer. I am an emergency physician practicing here in Toronto, Ontario, which I kind of jokingly refer to as kind of the France of North America. We're about 60% nuclear powered. We
Hmm.
had a nuclear build out at breakneck speed on a per capita basis that actually rivaled the French,
All right.
commissioning 20 reactors in just 22 years. But before I get ahead of myself, yeah, emergency physician, and about 5 years ago, I remember that number well because that's the age of my son. I became quite concerned about climate change,
Uh-huh.
and started to become quite a doomer, and not be very fun at parties. Just talk about how terrible the world was and where we were heading. In short, sort of hell in a handbasket. And my ex spouse at the time said, why don't you start complaining and do something about it? And I think
Hmm.
she had the idea that I should sort the compost better and take out the recycling. Um, and I started casting about for sort of science-based empiric solutions, and noticed that in the midst of all this doom and gloom, Ontario, where I live, wasn't doing too badly. In fact, we have one of the cleanest electricity grids in the world,
Hmm.
underpinned by mostly nuclear and then a good amount of hydroelectricity. Um, and discovered that I guess my own personal biases had been anti-nuclear. I wasn't an active anti-nuclear activist, but I thought about protesting a
Hmm.
research reactor of all things at
Okay.
my medical school, which actually produces a lot of life-saving medical isotopes. So
Yeah.
I was just very very confused, had a lot of unexamined beliefs in my youth, and started to examine those beliefs, and see that nuclear energy is a underdog technology, something that's very misunderstood. And for whatever reasons, my dopamine reward system is definitely unusual. Became sort of quite obsessed with the topic, and so I've started a couple of organizations, the Decouple podcast,
Hmm.
part of Decouple Media, and we're about 250 episodes into exploring the issues around climate, energy, the grid, environmental philosophy, all sorts of different topics.
Hmm.
Focus on nuclear, I'll acknowledge that. As well as I lead Canadians for Nuclear Energy, which is a
Hmm.
advocacy organization that's had a lot of success, most recently in saving the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, which is a 3,100 megawatt
Yeah.
collection of 6 large CANDU reactors, which feel very, very proud about. Our organization really accomplished something big there.
Hmm.
So I'm now permitted to take 7 million transatlantic flights per year. That's the carbon offset from saving this nuclear plant. So I should get over to Switzerland more often.
You're most welcome. I have to say, you're my number 32. Some not quite up to 240 episodes, and you're the first in English, actually. So you're
Okay.
gonna have to figure something out. Probably put it on YouTube and subtitle it. So you mentioned Canada's quite impressive nuclear fleet of 19 reactors in 4 power stations, almost all of which in Ontario, if I'm not mistaken. Can you just give us a short summary of what is currently happening in Canada's nuclear industry and energy politics?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, to understand the present, you have to understand the past, and I won't go through it in excruciating detail. But I think it is really important because the past informs the present, and it'll reveal something of my thoughts on nuclear and the kind of hope of nuclear deployment going forward. So you mentioned, yeah, we have 18 of those 19 operating reactors are in Ontario. We're a big country. This is embarrassing. I wouldn't pass my citizenship test in my own country, but I believe we're one of
Same
12
here.
one of 12 provinces. I know you have a lot of cantons and flags to remember over there in
Right.
Switzerland. But yeah, so why is it all in Ontario? So basically, Ontario has no coal, has no gas, has no oil. So just like France, where they said, nous n'avons pas de pétrole, mais nous avons des idées. We didn't have oil
Hmm.
or coal
Hmm.
or gas, but we had ideas. During the Second World War, we were kind of the Manhattan Project North. Much of Europe's expertise in terms of nuclear physics sought shelter, first in France and then in the UK, and they brought some of that precious heavy water made in Norwegian facilities, smuggled it out, being chased by the Nazis every step of the way, and that heavy water made its way to Canada. So we were involved in assisting the Americans, both with mined uranium and producing some plutonium at our national labs. But essentially, a massive investment was made in our nuclear sector, and immediately post-war, Canada made the firm sort of commitment and declaration. We had no interest in developing nuclear weapons, but we were quite interested in medical isotopes and in developing our own indigenous power reactor, the CANDU reactor, which is precisely what we did. And it's pretty remarkable that there are essentially 3 viable reactor technologies around the world. 2 of them are have a U.S. origin, the pressurized water reactor and the boiling water reactor, and then you have the heavy water pressurized water reactor, which is the CANDU. Why did we build so many in Ontario? Well, again, we didn't have any coal. We have large hydroelectric capacity in the form of Niagara Falls. I hope you come to visit sometime and take some pictures there. It's very beautiful.
On my list. It's on my list.
But we very quickly outstripped that hydroelectric capacity, and then we're dependent upon importing coal from the United States. There's all kinds of problems with that. We'd barge it across our Great Lakes, which sometimes froze up entirely. There was lots of rowdy unions in the United States in the coal sector, and we'd have disruptions in our energy supply. And we were rapidly industrializing a big automotive and manufacturing sector that was power hungry. And so we took a bit of a gamble and we said, okay, instead of building large coal stations, let's start building some large nuclear stations. And once we got going, we didn't look back. We built no more large coal stations after that. And indeed, we made the burning of coal illegal. That went through in 2014. It was 25% of our grid in 2005. And 9 years later, we had eliminated it entirely. So it's a really phenomenal story, one I'm really proud of. Tell the story around the world. And in terms of leapfrogging into the present, power demand in the West in many places has been pretty flat, and that's been partially because of globalization and offshoring of heavy industry, some efficiencies driven by LED lighting, for instance, but we haven't seen a lot of demand growth. And so something like nuclear, it's a lot like hydroelectric dams. You don't build these things willy-nilly. They are an expensive way to make cheap electricity, but you don't build a big capital intensive project if you're not sure that you'll have customers for the kilowatt hours coming out the back end. Right. And so, things have been pretty quiet for quite some time, coupled with obviously the reaction to the Fukushima meltdowns. Not a lot has been happening, but as we head into a sort of multipolar world and deglobalization, and we start reshoring industry, we have a lot of immigration as well here in Canada. We're seeing not just our sort of climate aspirations, but also our organic demand projections really tracking upwards. And so nuclear is back on the agenda. And we are the site of the Western world's first small grid-scale small modular reactors, which are working their way through the process. There's been some site preparation. We shouldn't exaggerate it. They've cleared some land and laid down some basic utility service for the construction project. But we've also committed to building close to 5,000 megawatts of new nuclear, which will most likely be large nuclear reactors. So yeah, I mean it's an exciting place to be. We have really maintained our nuclear sector. Our CANDU reactors have the opportunity to be refurbished at their every 30 to 40 years. So these units could go, who knows, 90, 100 years, but they're all reaching their 30 to 40 year birthdays. And we have made the choice to refurbish them, meaning we swap out the core essentially. And that's been going really, really well, ahead of schedule, on budget, which gives us, a lot of social license to move on to this next phase, which I think is something that's really lacking in the US and in Europe, where there's been a lot of difficulties with the EPR projects. Right. In Europe as well as non-Europe, in Britain.
Yeah.
Recently departed.
You mentioned SMRs, and I think it's a safe bet that Canada will be the first country to actually deploy a small modular reactor. And besides that, there's quite a bit of a hype going on. What is your take on this development? Will it fly? Will it live up to the hype?
This is a tricky question. So, I mean, first off, I'll just make a subtle correction there. China and Russia, well, Russia's definitely deployed small modular reactors on barges for the far north. Small modular reactors exist in the nuclear navy around the world. But yeah, you're right. In terms of building something on land, the Chinese are very close to finishing a small modular reactor. And we are, into the planning stages for sure. I think it's important. This is a part of sort of nuclear advocacy psychology is, we do so much pushing back against anti-nuclear narratives. And we see such hope and opportunity within this technology. Occasionally it can lead us to maybe be a little rose tinted. And again, I think nuclear stations are a lot like hydroelectric dams, and we shouldn't, in our exuberance, make claims that, hey, this is going to be easy, this is going to be fast. The West has not been great at executing mega projects, whether that's big bridges, airports, subways, hydroelectric stations, or nuclear plants, which is not an excuse. And we know that there have been many examples throughout earlier nuclear renaissances where things have gone well. But the small modular reactor terminology, I think, is really problematic. I think most of us would say that the term renewables is a horribly inaccurate concept, which sows a lot of confusion. The fact that you can lump in intermittent sources like, intermittent short-lived sources like wind and solar in with century-long hydroelectric dams, which are, can peak and are sources of reliable power when you're not having droughts. The fact that you can lump in, again, something like wind with biomass, and the absurdity of logging forests in North America, turning them into pellets, shipping them on big bunker ships across the Atlantic and burning them in retrofitted coal plants. That's all under
Germany.
The renewables label. Yeah. And so, similarly, we should take a swap at our own team. And SMR is just way too vague of a concept. So this includes things, I think the common perception, and this is even amongst policymakers. I've been involved in a lot of advocacy at our national and sort of state level. And you come to realize how the political sausage gets made and how politicians really don't know a lot. And so a term like SMR, again, what's being sold to them, including by nuclear advocates and nuclear associations in particular, is, hey, this stuff's made in a factory. It's just shipped to site. You just plug it in. Maybe you snap it together like Lego blocks. And this is horribly disingenuous. That might apply to something like a microreactor, right? Which is maybe 1 to 10 megawatts. You're getting down to a scale there where, yes, you could probably put that on a few flatbeds. There's minimal civil works. But when we're talking about, I think what most people are conceiving of grid scale SMR, we're talking at the 300 megawatt level. And these are major construction projects. They may be modular, but there's a lot of site preparation, civil works involved. And these are complex projects. And the economics are, I would say, untested, although we have tested it. The history of nuclear power is starting small and scaling upwards towards the gigawatt plus level. And there's very real reasons for that. So where does this concept come from? Again, I think if you said 20 years ago, the way to salvage the nuclear industry is to go small, everyone would have laughed at you. But in the last 10 or 15 years, this has almost become a consensus position. So it arises out of a number of factors prevalent last decade. The blowback from Fukushima, where there was an idea that we needed to, rebrand nuclear and maybe just even get rid of the term nuclear and just call things small modular reactors. Maybe try and slip that under the doormat or whatever the saying is. We thought that government will never get involved in nuclear again. They'll never backstop or finance nuclear projects. So we have to have these projects, in the $1 billion, $2 billion range, so the private sector can finance them. We were worried about our ability to construct large projects, and I think that's still something to consider. And most importantly, we weren't sure that the demand was going to show up. So again, if you're not sure that there's going to be demand for a full gigawatt of 95% capacity nuclear power, surplus baseload is expensive. So that's, I think, what led to this, and it was really desperate times, and those conditions are rapidly disappearing. The Fukushima hangover, I think, is largely settling as we battle very serious questions of energy security. particularly in Europe, where the endogenous fossil fuels have really been burned at this point in terms of North Sea gas, and where coal, despite there still being a fair amount of lignite left in Germany, we'll see how much more gets burnt, but that's just suffice it to say there are limited fossil resources in Europe. Europe made itself very dependent on Russian gas, and that is no longer an option. And so it's these energy security imperatives that are coming back. And as that makes us serious about deploying nuclear, I think a lot of this thinking is rapidly shifting. And if, for instance, if you look at Poland, in terms of their Ministry of Energy, they're looking at large reactors, American-style AP1000s, Korean APR 1400s, 1400 megawatts. There is a sort of private sector consortium looking at deploying 300 megawatt reactors, but it's a bit being marginalized. In Ontario, I think the path dependency is locked in. I think we will be building those 300 megawatt units, but I have to say they're a poor match for our current reality. We are a big grid. We're anticipating a lot of additional demand. It would be more economic if you can get the financing together to build big units. I sometimes look at it as we're doing charity work for Eastern Europe and for some of the smaller provinces in Canada that just physically can't fit a gigawatt scale reactor. And that is a rationale to do a small reactor. If you have a grid that's too small for a big reactor, you've got to go small, but it ain't going to be cheap. I'm not convinced it's going to be cheap. There's this idea of economies of multiples. If we can build enough of these and bang out enough units, we can get the cost down. I mean, that's the history of the French nuclear program, for instance, or the Canadian nuclear program. I don't see the promises necessarily being kept. And I think it's healthy that there's a degree of skepticism. I'm sometimes criticized for having that skepticism, but, I think having a diversity of voices and opinions, which can battle it out and hopefully base opinions in facts, is vitally important to getting this right. I think getting nuclear power right is of enormous consequence, whether it's climate, whether it's energy security, all of these considerations. So anyway, I'm giving you way too long answers. I hope your audience can stay on for the ride.
No worries. Speaking about that promise of SMR and other future developments, how much of a setback do you think it could be if the promise can't be kept?
Oh, it's massive. As I was saying, I mean, we have incredible social license in Ontario. We're not building new reactors. Let's be clear on that. We are refurbishing our CANDU units. These are $2 billion mega projects, 3 years to deliver, a very complex project management feat, a critical path sensitive to hundreds of inputs that need to be scheduled precisely. And, again, our early attempts didn't go terribly well. But we've really figured out a integrated project delivery system, which is guided by the utility, coordinating all of the various contractors, keeping people to schedule, just a meticulous project management culture. And, while again, it's not building a new reactor, I think people often fetishize and say, well, nuclear is not working out, or it's not economic anymore because there's a problem with antiquated technology. We should be using different coolants, different moderators. Let's get sexy with our nuclear steam supply systems. Really, when you crunch the numbers on that, as has been done at MIT in Boston, the nuclear steam supply system is like 20% of the cost. The vast majority of the cost, in terms of overnight construction costs, not financing costs, is in that project delivery. And again, that's where we've seen, I think, a lot of the struggles in Europe and America most recently, is with big delays, with inexperienced construction crews making errors, having to jackhammer up concrete that's been poured and re-pour it. And with modular designs like the AP1000, if those modules show up and they're not done to spec and they have to get sent back and done again, then you're delaying your critical path by months, and this is just costing a lot of money. So we have incredible social license for doing what we're doing, managing these complex projects in Ontario, but I don't think the same can be said necessarily in Europe, where Hinkley Point, Flamanville, Oikolotto have really been blowouts. And so we need wins. We can't afford any other losses. And so for me, I think we need to build established designs that we understand well with experienced construction crews, and put our focus where it needs to be, which is on the project delivery, on the construction and project management competence. It's not sexy. I don't think you'll attract a ton of venture capital that way, although maybe I have some friends working in that area. But yeah, that's maybe too long of an answer, but I am concerned. It does look, originally the GE Hitachi folks were saying that the BWX 300 was going to cost about $1 billion. The serious estimates I'm hearing now, US dollars, 3 to 3.5 billion. On a, per megawatt, that's approaching the cost of Vogel. And, that is the first of a kind. So it's possible they'll get it down significantly. But certainly, again, we have to be careful not to overpromise and underdeliver. I think there's going to be sticker shock on those first units, and we'll see if the population will give us the social license to say, okay, we understand that's a first of a kind reactor. We have faith that the costs are going to come down. But again, I think it's undisputed that the long-term economics of a gigawatt scale plant are better than a 300 megawatt plant. It may be easier to finance, but again, governments now are saying, hey, we're willing to spend our money because energy security imperatives are real. And it's sad that climate change imperatives are not so real. But, let's face the reality that we have. Governments like Poland are going, okay, we really need to get serious. In terms of the long-term economics, we'd rather have gigawatt scale reactors.
And the climate will profit of that too. So let's move on to public opinion towards nuclear energy. Is it generally accepted in Canada, or do you see the common divisions we see all over the world, the usual arguments in that debate?
I mean, typically where you have nuclear energy, nuclear is very popular, and that might be just in the surrounding community of the plant itself. Nuclear provides, exceptional quality employment, very healthy tax revenues. Nuclear communities tend to have awesome recreation centers, sports teams that have all the latest gear, and just, folks earning good, dignified wages, doing good, dignified work, recycling that money in their community. More broadly, in the province of Ontario here, which is again 60% nuclear powered, there is about 80% support for our new nuclear, not just the existing stuff.
All right.
So that's fabulous. I will say there's something kind of like the arrogance of hydroelectricity. So we have a couple provinces that are essentially 100% hydroelectrically powered. And I think they've had the luxury for a long time to sort of stick their noses up and say, yeah, we don't need any of this other stuff. And why don't we maybe go around and ban nuclear at the same time, just because we're never going to need it. And look at us, we're so clean and mean, et cetera. And this is, I'm a big fan of hydroelectricity, but I think one must not consider any electricity source in a silo. And of course, I mean, we flooded a area the size of Belgium for our Quebec hydroelectric fleet. What's interesting in terms of that hubris is it's starting to evaporate a little bit because, we don't think necessarily of hydroelectricity as being as intermittent as wind and solar. And to be fair, it's not intermittent on a sort of daily, weekly, even seasonal basis. But we're seeing with the impacts of climate change and changing weather patterns, both of the hydroelectric powerhouses in Canada are in deep trouble. Quebec lost $1 billion of export revenue. They heat with hydroelectricity, which is awesome. But they get sometimes very cold winters and they have to hold back water in those reservoirs. And so typically they're exporting a lot of excess water in the summer, but they had to hold back so they would be guaranteed they wouldn't freeze in the winter. And similar story in British Columbia, our other hydroelectric powerhouse. So those provinces, I think, are actually best suited. We know that nuclear and hydroelectricity are an amazing low carbon combination. I think you have that reality in Switzerland, Sweden, certainly, Ontario, France, not so much hydro, but certainly, again, wonderful complement. That steady baseload and using hydroelectricity to load follow and even peak. If you got it, wonderful. And there's a lot of talk of, well, you could use wind, solar, and hydro and use hydroelectricity as the battery. And there's some truth to that. You can hold back a bit more water in your reservoir when conditions are fine. But, we're heading into a world of extreme weather conditions. And what we're seeing more and more is that when it gets incredibly hot or incredibly cold, wind in particular disappears. I call it a fair weather friend. And so if you have a bunch of wind and solar and hydroelectricity, and the wind and solar, let's say the wind in particular disappears, you're not increasing the amount that you can peak. Because you can't just add more and more turbines into existing hydroelectric infrastructure because you'll flood the downstream communities. You'll do devastating damage to ecosystems, but probably more importantly, you'll flood villages and towns and cities downstream from these facilities. And so if we're heading into a world where we need, to be able to meet unexpected peaks in demand with a heat wave, for instance, and the wind is gone, we've installed, thousands and thousands of megawatts of wind and it just doesn't show up. All you're left with is the peak that you previously had from your hydro. So I might be getting kind of overly technical there, but nuclear plus hydro is an absolute dream come true. Unfortunately, these are both capital-intensive construction projects. Again, we must not be romantic about nuclear energy. It is an expensive way to make cheap electricity. Unfortunately, investors looking for 5-year return on investments are not going to be happy with nuclear or hydro, right? But I think we need to be planning more as societies. We maybe need to lean a bit more into a social democratic frame where we have some degree of planning of vital services. We don't need to plan the entire economy. We don't need to be like the Soviet Union. But there's areas that underpin the health of our economies and our societies. And I think the electric sector is one of those. And so there's an ability for public and private sectors, I think, to work together to build this, institutional infrastructure, which again underpins our collective well-being.
Just quickly coming back on the public opinion on nuclear. What are the arguments in the debate? Is waste a subject? I mean, Canada is quite far advanced in the process of finding a site for a repository. To what extent does that help in the debate?
Again, I might be being a bit cynical here, or just a realist, but I mean, let's look at the UK, for instance. The government there went from a policy of, okay, we'll get a reactor online every 10 years to saying, we're going to rapidly accelerate this. We're going to go to doing a reactor every year. Aspirational. I hope they get there. But was that because public opinion changed dramatically to want to sort of 10x the pace of nuclear deployment? No, it was because of energy security concerns. And yes, that shifts public opinion, because are you worried more now about three-eyed fish, or are you worried about keeping the lights on and staying warm? There's sort of pragmatic drivers, I think, of increasing acceptance of nuclear, which is not to say that it's not vital for communicators like yourself, like myself, to weigh in on these the boogeyman. I call them the 3 W's of nuclear anxiety, and that is waste, weapons, and whoops. And whoops would be accidents, right? So there's a lot of demystification absolutely that needs to occur. Is that happening because the general public is poring over primary research and trying to understand the harms from radiation and their relative toxicity compared to particulate air pollution? No, it's happening because of being in the age of the influencer. For better or for worse, people spend a lot less time reading extensively and certainly going to primary literature to form their opinions. They go, hey, well, there's this charismatic doctor, and he seems to think that nuclear energy is safe. Maybe I'll shift my opinion. Oh, there's this Brazilian supermodel, who's a Instagram phenomenon and has this incredible audience of young women, and she's making nuclear energy cool again. Oh, right on. Even politicians like Emmanuel Macron, like he went from being the one of the authors of the shutdown of the Fessenheim nuclear station in France to now being very bullish on nuclear and planning up to 14 new EPRs in France. So this is partially because of public opinion, but maybe it's sort of the tail wagging the dog. I'm not sure if I'm getting that expression right. But there are very serious energy security pragmatics, particularly in Europe, I think, which are reshaping the debate. And again, just that nuclear energy summit in Brussels recently, when populists see their leaders attending those summits, not necessarily the prime ministers or presidents, but actually quite a few showed up at that event. That starts to, I think, really give social license, and for people to look around and go, oh yeah, okay, our leaders are pro-nuclear now. Maybe this is something we should feel more comfortable with.
I'm just looking at my list. I think we have covered all the questions and come to the last one, which is another sort of we traditionally ask our guests for their personal forecasts. There's a lot happening in Canada's nuclear sector, as is all over the world, not least the mentioned development of small modular reactors. What is your view on the future of nuclear in Canada in particular and worldwide?
I'm going to get to that, but you did mention, I'd like to sort of add on to a little bit of our previous segment there, where you're asking again about the social license. You did mention that Canada's, pretty far along our process of our final waste solution, our deep geologic repository. Obviously, Finland's much further along, having actually.
I've been down there actually.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very interesting. I'm not sure what your background is, but I'm definitely not from within the nuclear industry. I'm a medical doctor. I'm a hobbyist. I'm a journalist. Um, it is interesting sort of being an anthropologist of the sector, um, where everything is an engineering solution and it's not necessarily an engineering problem that is being answered. So one of the sayings I like, a friend of mine, James Krellenstein, talks about this, like we're coming up with an engineering solution to a financing problem with small modular reactors, or we're finding an an engineering solution to a communications problem around waste, for instance. I'm someone who I think has a different take on nuclear waste. I can give you my sort of quick spiel, as quick as I can say anything. So we're at risk of long tangents here, but essentially, to understand waste, you need to sort of put it in context. Nuclear waste is incredibly dangerous. Freshly irradiated fuel straight out of the reactor. If you're standing anywhere near that, you're getting a lethal dose in seconds. Um, and yet somehow no one has ever died as a result of radiation from handling spent nuclear fuel in the civilian sector. There have been a couple of reprocessing incidents. We're talking probably less than 20 people, but in terms of just handling, and this is what happens in most of the world's reactors. This includes Russia. This includes places you might think don't have great safety cultures. There's been no one who's been died from handling civilian nuclear waste as a result of radiation. And so why is that if it's so dangerous? Well, we as industrialized human beings, we make dangerous things safe. And so I like to compare the nuclear industry to the aviation industry, and there's actually a lot in common there in terms of their safety cultures. Aviation, I mean, how many of us don't think twice about hopping into an aircraft? I just flew back from across the continent with my beloved 5-year-old and my beloved mother and my beloved fiance. We're flying at 30,000 feet or 10,000 meters to stay metric here for the European audience. There's minus 50 degrees Celsius up there. Oxygen levels are incredibly low. And you're in this aircraft with thousands of mission critical moving parts that need to be maintained in perfect working order, need to be inspected on an absolute diligent schedule. You need a air traffic control crew on the ground and pilots that are exceptionally well trained. With millions and millions of flights every year, we're talking 100 to 300 deaths every year from aviation, 17 times safer than driving your car. Well, what I just described there in terms of the complexity of making aviation safe, and that was not the exhaustive list, is orders of magnitude more complex than handling nuclear waste, which you remove from a reactor underwater. The water shields the waste. So even though if you were standing just in front of waste that wasn't underwater, you'd have a lethal dose in seconds. The water is exceptional. I mean, I've been around freshly irradiated nuclear fuel underwater, and the dose you're getting is almost nothing, certainly far lower than flying in an airplane. Waste is removed from the reactor underwater. It cools in a spent fuel pool for between 5 and maybe 10 years. And then it's removed underwater and packaged underwater into a concrete and steel lined container where it can sit for hundreds of years. And the really cool thing about nuclear waste is that it undergoes exponential radioactive decay. So, within 40 years, 99.9% of that original radioactivity is gone, and particularly the stuff that shoots out of the fuel and can penetrate. That stuff's gone. Within 400 to 500 years, you could hold a spent nuclear fuel bundle in your hands because the radiation that's left is not penetrating radiation. It's blocked by the layers of skin on your hand or aluminum foil in the case of beta radiation. And so we sort of conceive of this stuff as, well, it's not safe for millions or billions of years. If you can hold something in your hand in 500 years, I think that gives the public a very different perception and perhaps a different sense of urgency or timelines here. So again, as an anthropologist of the nuclear sector, looking at the waste issue, I've spent quite a bit of time with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And, you enter into their world, and at first you go, these people are completely insane. I mean, their risk-benefit analyses are off the charts crazy. I spoke with the one of the mathematical modelers looking at an absolute worst case scenario with our underground or deep geologic repository. And I said, what's the maximum dose? What's the maximum dose someone could get from this if everything goes wrong? And the scenario that they model for, actually, there are no casks, these steel and copper lined containers those just disappear. There's a undiscovered geologic fault with a ton of water moving through it. The maximally exposed person is living right over top with a well, getting their water from it, growing their own little permaculture farm of fruits and vegetables, and chickens laying eggs from, again, the most contaminated area. It takes 1 million years to get to the maximum dose, and that dose is 80 nanosieverts a year, which is less than a smoke detector in your house. And they wanted to get it even better than that, right? And so you go, these people are completely insane, right? And they want to spend tens of billions of dollars on this. The cost of our deep geologic repository is estimated to be $26 billion. I don't know how many kids you could send to university for that kind of money, or through trade school or whatever. But this is a incredible misallocation of societal resources. I mean, you could build a few nuclear plants and offset a whole ton of carbon. There are far better things to be doing with this. I think there are medium-term solutions, shallow burial in those dry casks, which are more than adequate. And again, taking things out of silos and out of isolation and comparing to other waste streams from energy, even if it's wind and solar, but particularly if it's coal with particulate pollution, or just the CO2 problem from natural gas and oil. This is a very manageable problem. I'm not going to belabor that point anymore, but I thought worthwhile tackling one of the W's and maybe providing the example of how I communicate about it. So in terms of a communications masterclass, the biggest thing is, again, we should not be religious about this. We should not overpromise and underdeliver. We should not say nuclear is cheap, because it's not. It creates cheap electricity in the long term, but it's an expensive upfront investment.
Yeah.
Number two, make comparisons, right? And I think the hydroelectric nuclear comparison are amazing in terms of these high value, long live assets that have high upfront capital costs. And similarly, like, look at the waste streams, look at those problems, acknowledge the problem. I think it's disarming to anti-nuclear folks to say, yeah, nuclear waste is deadly.
Yeah.
Right? But then explain how it's managed. So I wanted to get that out of the way, because we are sort of I would say we're closely behind Finland. We have a short list of 2 communities which will shortly be voting on whether or not they want to be willing hosts. There's a decent chance both communities will say no. And then we're back to square one, going to be soliciting again 20 or 30 communities that might be interested, and going through this social licensing process. Which is gold standard, best in class. But the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, last I checked, their annual budget is $100 million. And I asked them about that, and they said, well, drilling boreholes and testing geology is really expensive. Well, how many boreholes? Boreholes cost about $1 million each. Well, how many boreholes have you dug? I think it was 8. I was like, where's the other $92 million going? So it's a very bloated organization doing a lot of, I think, if you can do it, if there's no urgency to ever get anything built, then this sort of gold standard social licensing, community consultation stuff is awesome. But in a reality of, impending dangers from climate change, energy security imperatives, to me, it seems a little overblown. I don't have a great answer to how to deal with that, other than the fact that we should not be panicking about nuclear waste storage. We have plenty of time to work it out, and we shouldn't be spending tens of billions of dollars that could be better allocated. I forget what your actual last question was, but I
want to skip in anyway, if you allow me. I think Switzerland is actually in between Finland and Canada, because we have selected the site. And on the subject of dangerous nuclear waste, just last week I visited a hot laboratory handling spent fuel, and the guy that runs it, he told a story about a lady from the region where our repository will be, actually opposing it, visiting his lab. And she stood there outside of the hot cell, looking into the hot cell where there was a spent fuel element. And then it made her realize, inside, dead, outside, safe. So all it takes is the lead glass and the concrete that was between her and that fuel element. And that made her basically quit her position. And maybe we should just put all opponents through hot laboratories.
But I have 2 ideas. I mean, certainly it's very interesting if you survey the French general public. At least this survey, I think, is about 5 years old, but I believe it was kind of adults under 35. The majority thought that the steam coming out of the nuclear stations was full of carbon, that nuclear was a significant source of carbon pollution. And that's an
At least I
artifact
don't think
of,
it's radioactive.
well, maybe they do, but I mean, it's an artifact of the September 11th attacks, the tightening of security at nuclear facilities. Almost every French high school student, as I understand, used to tour a nuclear station.
Yeah,
And there's no better way to dispel fears than getting people,
true.
interacting, seeing the spent fuel, whether it's just the dry casks or the fuel in storage. I mean, seeing how much waste has been created by a nuclear station. Spoiler alert, it's absolutely astonishingly small amounts. But yeah, the more we can get the public to interact. The other thing, and this is kind of a joke, but I'd love, a reality TV concept where you would get some anti-nuclear activists, maybe an anti-nuclear activist-led family, like some Greenpeacers, to go and live with a nuclear family who maybe work at a nuclear station, and maybe vice versa, right? And film it. I think it would just be incredible, because I think it's starting to lose a little bit of its, emotionality and how hyper polarized it is. But, anti-nuclear activists, God bless them, well-intentioned, I think really perceive of people working in the sector as being almost the embodiment of evil. The association with nuclear weapons, the fears of radioactive contamination and, causing cancer in children, et cetera, make them feel that people working in the sector are inhuman, that they're evil. And it's been very interesting. I mean, I've got to interact with a lot of people in the nuclear sector, mostly in the labor movement. Nuclear has one of the highest wages as a result of high rates of unionization. And these are very good people, very diligent people, who are absolutely acting in, I think, the public interest. And at least, just getting to talk to each other. Like, there's way too much of this, and social media is amplifying it, but we're talking at each other, not with each other. And I personally would love to see this television show. So I don't know if you have any TV producers following your podcast.
Well, I don't know. I could ask, but I like the idea, and I think it's a good point to end this. Chris, thank you so much for your time. Also, thank you for your efforts in campaigning for nuclear. Rest assured that it is noted overseas, at least in the nuclear community as well. And talking to people like you always makes me realize what a privilege it is to actually get paid for my contribution to the cause of nuclear. Chris, thanks a lot.
Wonderful. My pleasure.